Hi everyone, today is Monday, September 19th, and this video is actually going to be about violence in nonprofit housing. First of all, how many of you actually have taken a look into this thing called nonprofit infrastructure? First of all, theoretically, if something is defined as nonprofit, then why does it receive funding? One of the things that's incredibly disturbing, for example, in the Canadian demographic, is this thing called nonprofit housing. Now, looking at, for example, a particular province, let's say Ontario, Canada. Haven't looked at Nova Scotia, haven't looked at, for example, British Columbia, have not looked at Alberta, have not looked at Manitoba, have not looked at Saskatchewan, and haven't looked at PEI or even the Yukon. But one of the things that is incredibly problematic is this system that you actually have in, for example, nonprofit housing business. In Ontario, Canada, they have, just take a look at how they set themselves up, these things called nonprofits. If you actually read a lot of stuff around nonprofit this, when you actually structure an organization and you get funding, that's for profit purposes. You can't present yourself as, for example, being in the business for nonprofit, because if you are in the business for nonprofit, then you know what, everything is volunteer. So one of the things that's actually happening in the Ontario demographic is that there's now a lot of reviews being done to say, okay, you know what, how do we actually recover this? How do we actually recover financial costs? Because there seems to be a lot of stuff going into certain sectors that are doing nothing to address, for example, social problems related to poverty, unemployment, even related to stuff that's clearly connected to residue from colonization. It's a huge problem in Ontario, Canada. So they have this thing in Ontario, Canada, starting with, called nonprofit housing. What exactly is that business about? If you actually look at, for example, concentrations of certain individuals in this thing called non-profit housing, who has actually spoken to, for example, the racialized communities in these places about alternative ways to actually invest in developing capital in different ways? None. And they've had like even generations of, for example, people from racialized communities that have been living in this thing called non-profit or subsidized housing. So what is the purpose of all this stuff? What? They have this non-profit housing culture in Ontario that's very, very cliquey-like. They get all this funding, from we don't even know where. And I don't think they even know themselves. Not one of them have actually come forward and said, you know what, we need to stop how this system operates, because it is not a nice system. It's not beneficial. You have, like, for example, nonprofits that are into the business of accumulating capital related to housing. That's another form of imperial building. And there's been no analysis of that. You also have nonprofits that, for example, commodify or exploit the vulnerabilities related to, for example, food access. And you know what? They create these infrastructures, and on one hand, they present themselves as doing this charity, work, and then on the other hand, they are incredibly violent and disgusting towards the communities that actually I don't want to say they serve, but the communities that actually give them business. I was in one demographic, and I just sat and I watched for about 10 years how this whole sort of poverty infrastructure sort of operates, and how racial profiling comes into things, and how people are displaced into something called subsidized housing, how this subsidy business fucks up people, how this non-profit housing business actually says they're doing charity work. They're not doing charity work. And then I look at the racialized experiences in there, and I look at the Caucasianized experiences in these systems. And you know what? Why do we see a lot of ourselves concentrated in, for example, these communities where you have